At 11:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, the parking lot of the Fort Belvoir Commissary Annex is half empty and wet. Rain has been coming in from the south since before dawn, the kind that doesn't break, just settles. And the asphalt near the cart return is slicked the color of slate. Colonel Adrian Carr, in full Army service uniform, dress blue greens, spit-polished shoes, the brass on his chest reading to anyone who knows how to read it, is loading the last of his grocery bags into the trunk of his Acura. A box of pasta, 2 cans of black beans, a chicken he'd planned to roast. His wife Denise had texted him a list at lunch. He'd made it to the commissary with 40 minutes before his 1 p.m. meeting back at the Pentagon. He is not going to make it to that meeting. The sound of the trunk lid closing is still hanging in the wet air when Brett Winslow's cruiser pulls into the lot and positions itself 45 degrees off Carr's bumper. The blue light is not yet strobing. It's just a presence, a positioning, a statement made without words. Winslow is 36, blonde, built the way men are built when they have spent their 20s in the gym and their 30s learning that nothing they are is actually what makes them powerful. The power comes from the belt. He gets out of the cruiser and walks toward Carr with the kind of stride a man uses when he has never been told to walk a different way. Before Carr has even turned around, Winslow has started speaking. "Step away from the vehicle." Carr turns. He is 46, which means he has been serving in the U.S. Army for 22 years. Longer than Winslow has been alive. His ribbons run 3 rows down his chest. His face is composed in the way trained men learn to compose their faces in rooms where the consequence of one wrong expression is measured in blood. He takes a step back from the car. He keeps his hands visible. "Officer," Carr says, "what can I help you with today?" Winslow doesn't answer the question. He asks his own, "Do you have any ID on you?" Carr reaches into his uniform pocket, slow, deliberate. The kind of movement that says, "I am reaching now. I am taking out my wallet now. I am handing you my credentials now." He pulls out a solid white government-issued card. It is his Common Access Card, his CAC, the military's equivalent to a driver's license, issued by the Department of Defense. The photograph on it taken at a base photo center and the card laminated and federal. It has his name. It has his rank. It has his Armed Forces identification number. It is the document that gets him into secured facilities where the nation's defensive strategy is discussed. Winslow glances at it, then he hands it back without looking at Carr's face. "I need a state-issued ID. This is not unusual. It is also not reasonable. But the distinction between the two states is not one Winslow operates in. Carr does not argue the point. He is holding a military identification card issued by the federal government, a card that represents more security clearance than Winslow's badge and uniform combined. Carr does not say this. Instead, he reaches back into his wallet and retrieves his Virginia driver's license. His hands are steady. The rain is starting to soak through the shoulders of his uniform. Winslow takes the license. He looks at it for a long moment, long enough that Carr understands something has shifted. This is not a routine check. Winslow is looking for a reason to continue looking. "What brings you to the commissary today, Colonel?" There is an edge in the way Winslow says the rank. Not respectful, but not disrespectful either. Practiced, like a man testing a word in a language he doesn't speak to see if it will slide off his tongue or stick. He is also still holding the driver's license, not returning it, establishing through the small act of retention that he is the one who decides when this ends. "Groceries," Carr says. "I was running an errand before my next meeting at the Pentagon." "What kind of meeting?" "That's not really relevant, is it?" Carr's voice is still level, But there's something underneath it now. Not anger, just the specific precision of a man who has started to understand that composure in this moment is itself a form of resistance. Winslow steps closer. He is inside Carr's space now, the kind of proximity that is used to force someone into either backing up or standing their ground. Carr does not back up. He does not stand his ground with his body. He stands it by remaining still. This is the distinction Winslow cannot see. The difference between compliance and refusal made visible only to someone who knows where to look. Winslow reaches out and places his hand on Carr's right shoulder. It is not a gesture. It is a statement. I need you to step away from the vehicle. Turn around. Put your hands where I can see them. Carr complies immediately. He turns slowly. He places his hands at shoulder height, palms open, fingers spread. This is not the first time he has done this. It is not even the 5th time. But it is the first time his wife is going to have to make a call she never thought she would make. That is still in the future. Right now, Carr is simply processing what has just happened in a 90-second window. A man decided that the uniform on Carr's chest was not real, or was not relevant. And that decision cascaded into a series of actions that Carr now has to navigate while remaining intact enough to remember it. Winslow is already reaching for the radio at his shoulder. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I've got a male subject at the commissary annex, possibly armed, needs backup. Carr knows that word, armed. He has not made a move that could be interpreted as reaching for a weapon. He is not carrying a weapon. He is carrying groceries and a philosophy that composure under duress is the only form of power available to him right now. But he has also understood, in that 90-second window, that he is going to be written into a report that will not match what Winslow saw. The report will have to justify the call for backup. The facts that exist right now, a man in a military uniform, loading groceries, who answered questions directly, do not justify backup. So Winslow will make new facts. This is the moment Carr reaches a decision, not in words, in action. He knows his phone is in his uniform pocket. He knows what Winslow has started to do will not be invisible if someone is there to see it clearly. He does not reach for the phone to record Winslow's face. That would trigger escalation. And escalation with a man who has already called for backup is a path Carr has learned not to walk. Instead, he acts as though he is complying completely. He reaches down, slow, speaking as he moves. I'm going to reach into my pocket, Carr says. I'm getting my phone. I need to contact my command. Let them know I'm detained. Winslow doesn't answer, but he doesn't stop Carr either. Carr retrieves his phone. He does not look at the screen. He does not press any buttons. He simply places the phone, face up, on the hood of his car. The camera lens is angled upward, toward Winslow's face, toward the blue light, toward the rain, toward whatever is about to happen next. No one watching the lot would see this as unusual. A man has placed his phone on his car because his hands are about to be restrained. And he does not want anything in his hands when other officers arrive. It is reasonable. It is also a calculation. And calculations of this kind are what a man carries in his spine after 22 years of military service. Winslow watches Carr place the phone. He does not understand what he is seeing. All he sees is a man complying. Within 90 seconds, a second cruiser has pulled into the lot. A third arrives 3 minutes after. They have not seen the phone on the hood. They do not know it is there. Winslow does not mention it. No one mentions it for 6 hours. The detention begins at 11:47 a.m. Carr is told to face the vehicle and place his hands on the hood. He does. One officer secures his right wrist with a zip tie, the kind used for temporary restraint before handcuffs are applied. Then his left wrist. The plastic cuts in a specific way. Cold, thin, designed to be tight enough that a person cannot slip their hands without cutting off circulation. Carr has not resisted. He has placed his groceries on the back seat. His hands are secured. He is facing the hood of his own car. An officer asks him if he has anything on his person. Carr tells him about his wallet, his phone, his house keys. The search finds nothing else. No weapon, no contraband, nothing that justifies the 3 cruisers, the backup, the zip ties, the specific tone that has entered every officer's voice, the tone that says we have decided who you are, and we are not interested in evidence to the contrary. "What were you doing at the commissary?" the first officer asks. "Buying groceries," Carr says. "Where are you coming from?" "The Pentagon, G3 Directorate." Carr is not offering more than is asked. He is not being evasive. He is being precise. "You work at the Pentagon?" "I work at the Pentagon." "Doing what?" "Operations, strategic planning." Carr is not lying. He is also not elaborating. There is a calculation in every sentence, how much information serves this moment, and how much serves the record that will come later. The officer is not satisfied. "Why are you out of your base in the middle of the day?" "I had 40 minutes. I went to get groceries. I was heading back to my next meeting." The rain is heavier now. It is starting to soak through the uniform jacket. 41 minutes will pass before a supervising officer arrives and reviews what has been detained. But Carr does not know that yet. He only knows that his hands are bound in cold plastic. His face is to the hood of his car, and there are 3 officers around him in a parking lot where the only other person who might be watching is a delivery driver in a Hartwell logistics truck, parked at the far edge of the lot, who has not moved since Winslow's cruiser pulled in. The driver's name is Derek Vance. He is 31. He was supposed to finish his route 30 minutes ago. He is not finishing his route. He is watching. His dashboard camera is recording. Carr's uniform jacket is soaked through. The rain is coming harder from the south. One of the officers has asked if he needs anything. Carr has said no. He is not being combative. He is being compliant. He is being calm. And he is discovering, in real time, that none of these things matter. Compliance does not end this. Calm does not end this. The uniform, which he put on this morning because he was meeting with planners who respect the rank it represents, is the exact reason this is happening. To Winslow, the uniform was not a credential. The uniform was a problem to be solved. A man who wears that uniform, in Winslow's calculation, must be brought to heel. It is the only way Winslow can be certain that his authority is real. 41 minutes of this. 41 minutes of rain and zip ties and officers circling. 41 minutes of a man who has served his country for 22 years, standing against his own car in a parking lot while being treated as a threat to be managed. Then a sergeant arrives. He is older than Winslow. He looks at the scene. A man in a colonel's uniform restrained against a vehicle, and the first thing he does is review the reasoning. He asks Carr his name. Carr tells him. He asks Carr if he is armed. Carr tells him no. He asks to see the military ID. Carr tells him it is in his car, in his wallet. The sergeant retrieves it. He looks at it. Then he looks at Winslow. What passes between them is not spoken, but it is clear. The sergeant has understood something in that moment that Winslow does not understand and has not understood from the beginning. The man against the car is not a civilian making an argument about his rights. The man against the car is a colonel. The uniform is real. The Pentagon credential is real. And the detention that just happened is not going to be invisible. The sergeant speaks to Winslow. Cut him loose. The zip ties are removed and Carr's hands are freed. He brings them down, slowly, and stands up straight. His uniform is soaked. His chest is heaving, though his face does not change. He has not been beaten. He has not been injured. He has been restrained without cause for 41 minutes. And the difference between those two states is the difference between what will and what will not show up in a doctor's report, and between what will and will not matter when the lawyers arrive. The sergeant apologizes. He actually apologizes, tells Carr he is free to go, that there was a mistake in the initial report. Carr nods. He thanks the sergeant. He does not thank Winslow. He walks back to his car, retrieves his phone from the hood where he placed it, and sits in the driver's seat. His hands are shaking, not from fear, from the specific muscular release that comes when a man has held himself together through 90 seconds of escalation and then 41 minutes of restraint. And finally, in the privacy of his own car, he lets his body remember what just happened to it. He puts the car in reverse. He drives out of the lot, behind him. At the far edge of the parking area, the Hartwell Logistics delivery truck is still visible. Derek Vance is still watching. The dash cam is still recording. The footage exists now. Carr does not know this yet. He only knows that the groceries are still in the car, that his meeting at the Pentagon is now gone, that Denise is going to have to hear about this, and that something has shifted, not in his body, but in the record. The record now exists. In the parking lot, Winslow is getting back into his cruiser. He has made the arrest and then made it disappear through the intervention of a sergeant he outranks in the institution's moral accounting, but not in its actual chain of command. He does not understand why the uniform mattered more, in the end, than his authority. He only knows that it did. That knowledge will sit with him for 6 hours, until the moment Derek Vance decides that what he has on his dash cam is not a private traffic stop between a cop and a civilian. It is a federal crime. Hash the uniform he was wearing. In 2004, in a tent in Fallujah, Colonel Adrian Carr was sitting across from 2 other colonels at a folding table with a single overhead bulb hanging from the canvas above them. The promotion board for field grade officers was held in temporary quarters, in a temporary city, by men who were themselves temporary, rotating through theater on 18-month appointments and then going home to wives and children, and the long work of pretending they had not spent 18 months in a place where the cost of a wrong decision was measured in caskets. Carr was 34 then. He had already served 12 years. The other colonels knew his file. They had read his evaluations. But they wanted to understand something that does not appear in written evaluations. And so the board president asked him a question that Carr has carried for 2 decades. What do you do when the order is wrong and the clock is running? It was not a test with a single right answer. Carr understood this immediately. It was a probe into how a man thinks under the specific pressure that the military creates. The pressure of authority pressing down from above. The pressure of consequence pressing up from below. And a human being in the middle who has to decide, in seconds, whether obedience or conscience carries the heavier weight. Carr answered honestly. He said he would execute the order as given, ensure it was documented, and then immediately escalate through his chain of command with a formal objection. He would not stop the order through passive refusal. He would not sabotage it. He would also not pretend that he had not seen the problem. He would make himself the record of what he knew. And then he would live with what happened next. The board president nodded. He did not smile. He told Carr he was approved for promotion. Carr rose from the folding table, shook their hands, walked out into the heat and the dust, and went back to work. That was the whole thing. It took 90 seconds. It changed nothing about that day. It changed nothing about the war. But it became the frame through which Carr understood his own conduct for the next 22 years, the specific architecture of how a man carries authority without letting authority carry him. He did his second tour. He watched his peer cohort separate from the service, take their severance, and walk into civilian life. He made the choice to stay, not out of patriotism, though he was patriotic, but out of something quieter and more stubborn. He had spent 12 years building a record of how a man conducts himself under pressure. He was not ready to stop building that record. His wife understood this. Denise had married a man who understood that service was not a job you could do halfway. She had given him 2 decades of marriages that operated on a rotation schedule, children's school plays he attended 3 years late, and the specific burden of loving a person who had learned to make composure look like choice rather than survival. Carr made 06 in his early 40s. The promotion was clean and unambiguous. His 2019 board letter sat in his personnel file, one paragraph of the formal evaluation that had qualified him for command. Colonel Carr has demonstrated unshakable composure under direct enemy fire. Iraq 2004. His leadership capacity grows from a core understanding of accountability, not as a constraint on authority, but as the foundation of it. His presence in a room changes the texture of how decisions are made, recommended for advancement without reservation. That sentence, unshakable composure under direct enemy fire, would become the most important sentence in Carr's life. Though he did not know this on the day he read the board letter, he did not need to know it. He only needed to understand what it meant about him. That the thing he had learned to do in a tent in Fallujah, in 90 seconds, in response to a question about the cost of silence, had been documented by officers who understood exactly what they were looking at. It was not weakness. It was not cooperation with injustice. It was the specific discipline of a man who had learned that the only power available to him was the power to bear witness, to document, to refuse to disappear what he had seen. Denise was 38 when Adrian made colonel. She was working then at Fort Belvoir Medical Center as a registered nurse, a position she had held for 11 years. She understood military service because she lived it, not because she had enlisted in it. She had chosen to remain visible to a man who had learned to make himself less visible through decades of control. They had built a life on the understanding that what held them together was not the Pentagon's schedule, but the mutual knowledge that they both moved through the world under some version of discipline, hers as a healthcare provider, his as an officer. They did not discuss this. They simply lived it. On the afternoon that Adrian Carr was detained in the commissary parking lot, Denise was 6 hours into a 12-hour shift at Fort Belvoir Medical. She was not thinking about Adrian. She was managing a ward of post-surgical patients, tracking medication schedules, monitoring vitals, and moving through the controlled speed of someone whose mind can only hold one sequence at a time. She had learned this rhythm 22 years ago when her husband first deployed. You do not let the other part of your life intrude on the room you are standing in, because the people in this room need a nurse who is entirely in this room. Her pager went off at 5:47 p.m. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. She excused herself from the ward, walked to a quiet corner of the hospital corridor, and called back. A woman's voice answered immediately, professional, not panicked, but carrying an undertone of something that Denise's nervous system registered before her conscious mind did. The woman identified herself as calling from Kessler County Police Department. She said Adrian had been detained pending a report of a security concern. She said he was being processed and would be released pending the outcome of the investigation. She said Denise should not be concerned. Denise asked one question: what kind of security concern? The woman on the phone did not answer directly. She said, "Your husband is cooperating fully. He'll be released as soon as we complete our assessment." Denise understood, in that moment, that the woman was reading from a script, and that the script existed because something had happened that required a script. She thanked the woman. She ended the call, and then she stood in the hospital corridor for 3 seconds, very still, and made a calculation that was not really a calculation. It was a decision that had been made a long time ago, in the back of her mind, for exactly this kind of moment. She opened her phone. She scrolled to a contact she had entered 2 years ago after a conversation with another military spouse. A name that had lived in her phone untouched, waiting. Marcus Trent, with a 202 area code, DOJ Civil Rights Division. She had never called him. She had hoped she would never need to. She had understood, in the way that women married to high-ranking military officers understand, that some things are preparation, not paranoia. She called him. Trent answered on the second ring. His voice was different from the police department woman's voice, not reading from a script, but immediately present to the fact that this call, at this time, meant something specific. Denise told him her name. She told him her husband's name and his rank. She told him what the police department woman had said, and crucially, she told him what the woman had not said. She told him that Adrian had been detained, that no charges had been filed, and that the whole conversation had lasted less than 2 minutes. Trent asked the 3 questions. He asked Adrian's current duty location. He asked if Adrian had been injured. He asked if Adrian had any visible marks or complaints of pain. Denise said no, no, and no. Trent told her, "Call me back the moment he's released. Do not wait. Call me while he's still in the car if you have to. Tell him not to speak to anyone without me on the phone. Not his command, not the police, no one." "Can you do that?" Denise said yes. She knew how to follow instructions. She had been following them from people she trusted for 2 decades. Trent told her to expect his call in the next hour. He said he was making some calls of his own, and then he hung up. And Denise was standing in a hospital corridor holding a phone and understanding, with the clarity that comes from having lived long enough to recognize certain kinds of moments, that her life had just bifurcated. On one side, the ward she had been managing, the patients she was caring for, the shift that had existed 5 minutes ago. On the other side, whatever was happening in Kessler County right now, in a parking lot she had never seen, with her husband and a police officer, and whatever sequence of events had produced that call. She went back to the ward. She did not tell anyone what had happened. She continued her shift at the same controlled pace, managing medications, tracking vitals, moving through the routine as though nothing had changed. But her mind was operating on a different schedule now. She was waiting for Adrian's next call. She was calculating the timeline when he would be released. How long it would take him to borrow a phone. How long the drive back from Kessler County would take. She was also beneath the calculation, containing something else, a fear so specific and so old that it had no name. It was the fear that she had always known existed, the fear that the institution her husband had given 22 years to would, in a single moment, decide that his composure was not strength, but something else, that his rank would not protect him, that the thing he had learned to do in Fallujah, to be present, to be visible, to refuse to disappear what he had seen, would be read by someone as a threat rather than as what it was. She did not let the fear move into her face. She did not let it change her voice. She contained it the way she had been trained to contain emotion in a hospital setting, as a private understanding that never touches the work. This was what she was good at. This was what marriage to a colonel had taught her to do. Make yourself small. Make yourself invisible. Do not let anyone see that the person you love has just been made less visible. The shift clock moved forward in small increments. Denise checked medication schedules. She called a doctor about a patient's elevated pressure. She asked a young nurse to monitor another patient's post-op drainage. She moved through the ward at the same pace she always moved, which meant she was actually moving much more slowly than her mind was moving, which meant she was aging in real time, minute by minute, in a hospital corridor in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, waiting for a call that would tell her whether her husband was safe or whether the institution she had married into had finally made the choice she had always known it could make. 3 miles away, in the Pentagon, other phones were starting to ring. #6 hours. At 6:07 p.m., Colonel Adrian Carr walked out of the Kessler County Police Department processing facility with a plastic bag containing his wallet, his house keys, and a Department of Defense Common Access card. There were no charges. The desk sergeant had explained this with the specific tone of a man who had been told to process and release without commentary. Carr had signed the form, a single page with a handwritten notation that he had been released pending investigation, and the sergeant had handed him the bag. The officer had also told him his phone had been placed in property during intake, and the battery was dead. Carr had thanked him. He had walked out into the November air, which was colder now than it had been in the afternoon. And he stood in the parking lot of a police station 40 minutes from his home, holding a plastic bag, trying to calculate what to do next. He needed to call Denise. He did not have his phone. He approached a woman who was walking toward the entrance and asked if he could borrow hers. She looked at him for a moment, at the uniform, at the expression on his face, and handed him her phone without asking questions. He dialed Denise's number from memory, a skill that belonged to a generation that had not yet outsourced all of its recall to devices. Denise answered on the first ring. "I'm out," Carr said. "I'm at the police station. No charges. I'm going to need to get back to the car." Denise's response came immediately, as though she had been waiting with the words already formed. "Trent already has it." A pause, then, "Come home." Carr handed the phone back to the woman. He stood in the parking lot and understood, from the specific confidence in Denise's voice, that the timeline had already moved past the point where this was a private matter. Trent already had it. He did not ask what it was. He knew. Someone had seen. Someone had recorded. Someone had decided that what they had seen could not be kept private. This is what the 6 hours had contained. At 12:15 p.m., approximately 40 minutes after Carr had left the commissary lot, Derek Vance had driven his Hartwell Logistics delivery truck into a Shell station 12 miles away. His route was supposed to finish at noon. It was now 12:15. He was behind schedule, but not so far behind that it mattered. He had pulled into a parking space away from the pumps and sat in the cab. He had opened his laptop. He had inserted the dashcam memory card into the drive. The footage from the commissary lot played across the screen, a wide angle, a color-corrected lens, the timestamp running in the corner, 11:47 a.m. Vance watched Brett Winslow's cruiser pull into the lot at 45 degrees. He watched Carr turn from his vehicle, He watched the initial approach. He watched the moment Winslow's hand went to Carr's shoulder. He watched the zip ties come out. He watched 41 minutes of a man in an army uniform standing against his car in the rain. Vance had sat in the cab of his truck for 53 minutes, not moving, not calling anyone, just watching the footage cycle through again and again and again. He knew what he had seen. He knew what the footage showed. He also knew that dashcam footage from a civilian delivery truck had become, in the last 5 years, a liability in ways that most people did not talk about directly. He knew officers who had requested to see footage. He knew drivers who had been asked, informally, to delete files. He knew the specific pressure that came from being the person holding the only clear record of something that powerful people had an interest in containing. At 1:08 p.m., Vance had pulled the card from the laptop. He had put it in his pocket. He had closed the laptop. He had started the truck. He had finished his route. He had delivered 3 more packages. He had returned the truck to the Hartwell Logistics Depot at 4:47 p.m. and clocked out. He had not called anyone. He had not uploaded the footage. He had not sent a text. He had sat with it. The hesitation lasted 14 hours. It would almost be long enough. At the Pentagon, Brigadier General Yolanda Okafor was in her office in the G3 Operations Directorate when the Army's duty officer called at 4:52 p.m. Okafor was 52, had served 28 years, and held the title Army Inspector General Liaison, a position that put her at the junction where institutional accountability met institutional power. She did not answer routine calls. Her phone did not ring for routine matters, so when the duty officer's voice came through with the opening line, "Ma'am, we have a situation involving a currently serving 06 in full ASU," she already understood that the next 60 seconds would change the shape of her evening. The duty officer explained quickly. A colonel from the Pentagon had been detained by local police in Kessler County, Virginia, approximately 3 hours ago. The circumstances were unclear. He had been released without charges. Command was concerned about the possibility of a civil rights violation. The Inspector General's office needed to know about it. Could she advise on next steps? Okafor asked for the colonel's name. Adrian Carr. She asked for his directorate. G3 Operations. She asked a single clarifying question. Do we have any documentation of the incident? The duty officer said they were working on it. Okafor said, "Find it. I need everything. The initial incident report, any police communications, video if it exists. Within the hour, route it to me directly. This moves up to the secretary's office immediately. Not tomorrow. Now." She hung up. She did not lean back in her chair. She opened her email and sent a message to the Undersecretary of the Army's Chief of Staff. Incident flag, serving 06, potentially civilly violated by local law enforcement. Full briefing package assembling now. Anticipate Secretary notification within 2 hours. The machinery was engaging. Not slowly, not by the book. The book had already been written for exactly this kind of situation, and Okafor had read it. She had memorized it. She had built her career on understanding how institutional power moves when it has decided to move. At 5:02 p.m., a dispatcher from Kessler County Police Department received a call from the Pentagon, not a representative of Carr's command, but an actual staff officer, asking for documentation of the detention. The dispatcher transferred the call to the chief's office. Chief Gerald Pruitt took the call himself. He listened to the Pentagon officer explain that they were requesting all materials related to the detention of Colonel Adrian Carr. Pruitt told the officer that the matter was under investigation and that he would be issuing a statement tomorrow. The Pentagon officer said, "Sir, we need the documentation now, not tomorrow." There was a silence. Then Pruitt said he would have his records officer send over what they had. The records arrived at the Pentagon by 5:06 p.m. Incident report, initial dispatch logs. The reason for the stop listed as report of suspicious activity in commissary parking lot. There was no name for who had made the report. Okafor read the incident report and knew, before she had finished the first paragraph, that it was a lie. There was no suspicious activity. There was a man loading groceries. The documentation had been constructed to justify an intervention that had no legitimate basis. At 5:14 p.m., a staff officer in the Operations Directorate received an external email from Derek Vance. The subject line read, "Dashcam footage, Fort Belvoir Commissary, 11:47 a.m. Incident." The email contained a link to a cloud drive. Vance's message was 3 sentences. "I was in the commissary lot this morning. I recorded the incident. You need to see this. I'm uploading it now." The officer opened the link. The footage played. The officer did not finish watching. He printed a screenshot, picked up his phone, and called Okafor's office directly. "Ma'am, we have video. It came in from a civilian witness. You need to see it immediately." Okafor was in the video within 90 seconds. She watched 41 minutes of detention compressed into 4 minutes of playback. She watched Winslow's movements. She watched Carr's composure. She watched the rain. She watched the specific moment when everything that would follow became inevitable, because the evidence existed now, and the evidence was unambiguous. At 5:47 p.m., the Secretary of the Army watched the same footage on a secure screen in his office. The Undersecretary watched it standing next to him. Neither man spoke during the playback. When it ended, the Secretary said one sentence: "Get the DOJ Civil Rights Division on the line. Now. Tell them we have a federal deprivation of rights case incoming." The call was routed at 5:51 p.m. The DOJ answered at 5:52 p.m. The Secretary explained the situation in under 2 minutes. The DOJ said they would be opening an emergency investigation. The Secretary said, "We're sending you everything we have within the hour. This officer's prior complaints need to be part of your brief. There are 7 of them. All black male civilians. None sustained." The Secretary hung up. He turned to the Undersecretary and said, "How many people know about this right now?" "Outside the department," the Undersecretary said, "probably 30. Inside, probably 200. Inside the county police department, probably 5. The Secretary nodded. "Good. Let it move. The faster this moves through the institutions that know how to handle it, the faster the local department loses the ability to contain it." At 6:07 p.m., the moment Carr walked out of the police station, the chain had already reached the federal government. At 6:15 p.m., it would reach the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, where a prosecutor named Marcus Trent would see the dashcam footage for the first time and understand exactly why Denise Carr had called him 3 hours earlier. At 6:31 p.m., Carr's command would receive a flag from the Pentagon that his detention had been flagged as a potential civil rights violation and that the DOJ had opened an investigation. By 7 p.m., the story would be impossible to contain because the institutions with power had decided, simultaneously and without needing to coordinate, that it would not be contained. Carr did not know this yet. He was driving home on Interstate 95. The borrowed phone returned to its owner, his personal phone still dead in evidence at the police station. Denise knew more than he did. She knew that Trent had it, whatever it was. She did not know about the Secretary of the Army, or the video reaching the Pentagon, or the DOJ opening a federal investigation. She only knew that her phone call to a man she had never actually met had been the right decision, and that the weight she had been carrying alone, for 3 hours, in a hospital corridor, was about to be distributed across institutions that had resources he did not have, an authority she had been right to invoke. Car pulled into the driveway at 6:47 p.m. Denise was waiting in the doorway. She did not ask him what happened. She did not ask him about the detention, or the police, or why he had been held. She said, "Marcus is coming to the house. He's driving down from D.C. now. He'll be here around 8:30. He wants you to not speak to anyone until he gets here. Not your command, not anyone. He said that's critical." Carr nodded. He understood military protocol. He also understood, in that moment, that his wife had understood something in her call to Trent that she had not stated aloud. This was going to move beyond the personal. This was going to move beyond his dignity, or his rank, or his career. This was going to move into the institutional realm, where the institutions themselves would have to take sides, and where, once they had taken sides, they could not retreat without dismantling themselves. He kissed her. He went inside. He sat in his own home, in a dry uniform for the first time since the commissary, and waited for the next thing. The next thing was already in motion. It had been in motion since 4:52 p.m. It would not stop. The chief speaks. The morning after the commissary lot, Brett Winslow's kitchen was lit by the kind of pale November sun that comes through a window without warmth. He had set a tablet against the toaster and was watching the local news feed while his wife made coffee. The news anchor was running a chyron about an Army colonel and an incident at Kessler County. The footage had not yet been released. It would not be released for another 18 hours. So what was on screen was text only. Army statement confirms incident involving uniformed officer in Kessler County. Winslow watched the chyron cycle through twice. Then he said, to no one in particular, "They're going to make this into something." His wife did not respond. She was pouring coffee into a mug. She had learned over the years not to respond to statements like this. The coffee steamed. The morning continued. What Winslow was experiencing in that moment was not paranoia. It was something more specific and more dangerous. It was the confidence of a man who had run this exact script 7 times before and walked away from all 7. 7 complaints filed against him over 4 years. 7 incidents involving black male civilians. 7 times he had been questioned, investigated, cleared. 7 times the system had held. He had developed, through this repetition, a certain kind of faith in the system's capacity to absorb what he did. The system worked. It had proven this to him repeatedly. So when he said, "They're going to make this into something," he was not expressing fear that the system would fail. He was expressing the specific frustration of a man who believed he understood how the system worked, and who expected it to work the same way it always had. The system had changed 6 hours after he left the commissary lot. He did not know this yet. He would not know it until the footage reached him, and by then, it would be too late to adjust his strategy. What he was operating from was institutional memory, the memory of 6 prior incidents that had dissolved, been managed, been made to go away through the specific machinery of a local police department that knew how to protect its own. At 10 a.m., Chief Gerald Pruitt walked up to a podium in the Kessler County Police Department's public information room. He was 58, had been chief for 9 years, and understood his job as the management of narrative. The room had maybe 12 reporters, local news, one state outlet, no national presence yet. Pruitt wore his dress uniform. He had prepared a statement. He had anticipated the questions. He was about to deliver what he believed was institutional control. This morning, I want to address the incident that occurred yesterday in the commissary parking lot, Pruitt began. An officer from this department conducted what he believed to be a lawful traffic stop based on a report of suspicious activity. The individual in question was released pending investigation. Our department is cooperating fully with any inquiries, and we are confident that a thorough review will vindicate Officer Winslow's conduct. He paused. He had more to say. He had rehearsed this part. Officer Winslow has served this community without a single sustained complaint. He is a dedicated law enforcement professional, and this department stands behind him completely. We believe the facts, when they are fully examined, will demonstrate that he acted appropriately and within department policy. The specific word was sustained, not complaint, because there were complaints, 7 of them, filed over 4 years, all involving black male civilians, all currently sitting in a file cabinet in the department's records room. But sustained was a legal term, a procedural term, a word that meant something very specific in the language of law enforcement, a complaint that had been investigated and found to have merit. All 7 of Winslow's prior complaints were unsustained, meaning they had been investigated, or claimed to have been investigated, and found to lack merit, meaning, in Pruitt's careful language, that Officer Winslow had no documented history of misconduct. What Pruitt did not understand, in the moment he said this, was that he was constructing a load-bearing wall out of a single word. That word would support his entire institutional defense. And that word would be the exact point of failure when someone who understood how to read institutional documents began to examine the actual complaint file. A reporter asked if the officer had used force, Pruitt said. The investigation is ongoing. I don't want to characterize any aspect of it until we have completed our review. Another reporter asked if the colonel had filed a complaint. Pruitt said, "Not to our knowledge. This department is taking the matter seriously and will conduct a thorough internal review." The statement ended. Pruitt took no further questions. He walked away from the podium with the specific confidence of a man who had delivered the institutional line and believed it would hold. He did not know that the dashcam footage existed. He did not know that it was, at that exact moment, being reviewed by attorneys at the Department of Justice. He did not know that his phrase, "without a single sustained complaint," would become Exhibit A in the federal obstruction of justice charge that would follow Winslow's indictment. At noon, the Kessler County Police Officers Union issued a statement that was considerably more aggressive than Pruitt's. The union rep stated that Officer Winslow had been placed in an impossible position by an individual who had been evasive and uncooperative. The statement characterized the detention as a lawful exercise of police authority in response to a legitimate safety concern. The union went further than Pruitt had. They were not simply defending Winslow. They were reframing the entire incident as something other than what it was. By 1:47 p.m., Brett Winslow was sitting in his union representative's office with a laptop between them. The rep was a man named Richard Hammond, who had represented 7 Kessler County officers in civilian complaints over the past 6 years. He had never lost a case. He had developed, like Winslow, a certain confidence in how these things worked. The confidence was about to be shattered. Derek Vance's dashcam footage had gone viral at 1:30 p.m. Not to the general public yet, but to legal channels, to civil rights organizations, to news outlets that had been waiting for video confirmation. By the time Winslow arrived at Hammond's office, the footage was already being analyzed by attorneys who understood federal civil rights law. By the time Hammond opened the file on his laptop, the footage had already been viewed by 3 separate federal prosecutors. Hammond hit play. The video opened with the wide angle of the commissary lot. The timestamp read 11:47 a.m. Winslow's cruiser entered the frame. The camera angle was perfect, high, wide, capturing everything. Winslow's initial approach, the moment his hand went to Carr's shoulder, the zip ties being produced, the rain. The 41 minutes compressed into 4 minutes of playback because Vance's dash cam had been running at double speed during the idle period. Winslow watched himself on the screen, his face, his movements, his specific gestures, all of it captured and immutable. He watched for 2 minutes without speaking. Then the footage ended. Hammond closed the laptop. The rep looked at Winslow and said, very clearly, "You don't say anything, not to anyone, not to the chief, not to anyone at the department, nothing. You understand me?" Winslow nodded. But he was not nodding in agreement with Hammond's instruction. He was nodding because he had just understood something that the footage had made visible to him. He had watched himself and seen, for the first time, what the interaction actually looked like from the outside, not from his perspective, not from his reasoning, but from the perspective of a camera that had no stake in the outcome. That was simply recording what happened. After a long moment, Winslow said, "The uniform confused him." Hammond looked at him. Winslow was still watching the blank screen where the footage had been. He said it again. The uniform confused him. That's why he was evasive. He didn't understand the uniform meant I had authority. What Winslow was doing, in that moment, was constructing a narrative that would allow him to remain coherent with himself. He could not accept that he had initiated a detention without cause. He could not accept that the presence of his badge and his cruiser was not, in itself, sufficient justification. So he was reframing the incident. The man had been evasive, and the uniform had confused him, and therefore the detention had been necessary. The narrative was internally consistent. It had its own logic, and it was completely incompatible with the video evidence that had just played on the screen in front of him. Hammond did not argue with this interpretation. He simply said, "Don't say that to anyone else. Ever. You understand?" Winslow nodded again. He had understood something, but not the thing Hammond meant. He had understood that the story he had been able to tell himself in the parking lot, when it was just him and Carr and the rain, was not going to survive contact with a video recording. But he had not understood that the story itself was the problem. He believed, still, that if he could just explain it correctly, that the uniform had confused the man, that the man had been evasive, that the circumstances justified the detention, then the logic of the situation would become clear to other people the way it was clear to him. He did not understand that clarity was not a matter of explanation. He did not understand that he was watching the end of the system that had protected him, and that the protection had ended not because the system had changed, but because the system had finally been shown what it had been protecting. Hammond told Winslow to go home. He told him to not speak to the media. He told him to not post anything on social media. He told him to not contact any witnesses. Winslow agreed to all of this. He left the office. He drove home. His wife asked him how it went. He did not answer her directly. He said, "It's going to be okay. Once people understand what happened, once they see the context, it's going to be okay." He still believed this. He would continue to believe this for another 8 weeks. until a federal grand jury handed down an indictment that would make clear, in legal language, that the context he was referring to did not exist, that the detention had been baseless, that the escalation had been unjustified, that the uniform had not confused anyone. The uniform had been exactly why the detention had occurred in the first place, and why it had continued for 41 minutes. But on that afternoon, sitting in his kitchen, Winslow still had access to the story he had been telling himself. The story where he was a professional doing his job. The story where the man had been evasive. The story where everything had a reason, and the reason was coherent. The coherence was about to dissolve, but it had not dissolved yet. Hash the case they built. 8 weeks. That was the timeline Marcus Trent was working with. 8 weeks from the dashcam footage reaching the Pentagon to the moment a federal grand jury would be asked to vote on whether Brett Winslow had committed a civil rights violation under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, a federal statute that makes it illegal for a person acting under color of law to willfully deprive another person of a right protected by the Constitution. Trent had prosecuted these cases before. He knew the architecture. Evidence first, legal theory second, institutional pressure distributed across multiple agencies so that no single point could be pressured into retreat. The first document he filed was a subpoena to Kessler County Police Department for their complete complaint file on Brett Winslow. The subpoena was not a request. It was a demand backed by federal authority, and it carried with it the implicit promise that if the county did not produce the file, a federal judge would compel its production, and the failure to produce would itself become grounds for additional charges. Chief Pruitt's office responded within 2 days. They produced a file that contained 7 complaints filed against Winslow over a 4-year period. All 7 involved black male civilians. All 7 had been marked unsustained, meaning they had been investigated and closed without finding evidence of misconduct. Trent read through the complaints in his office on a Tuesday afternoon. The first complaint, filed 3 years prior, alleged that Winslow had used excessive force during a traffic stop. The complainant was a black male, age 28, with no prior criminal history. The complaint had been closed after an internal investigation that took 17 days. The second complaint, filed 2 years prior, alleged that Winslow had conducted a search without probable cause. Again, a black male civilian. Again, closed after an investigation that had lasted less than 3 weeks. The pattern continued through all 7. 7 complaints, 7 unsustained findings, 7 black men. No explanation in any of the files for why the investigations had concluded as they had, or what the investigating officers had actually found. Trent copied the file. He sent it to the federal prosecutors working the case with a note. This is what Pruitt meant by, without a single sustained complaint. This is what he was defending. Look at the pattern. The second document Trent filed was a preservation demand directed at Kessler County's Records Division. The demand ordered the department to preserve all in-car camera system recordings from November 18th, the date of the incident, going back 6 months. This was not speculation. This was institutional knowledge. Police departments, when they know a case is moving toward federal prosecution, sometimes attempt to archive or overwrite their video systems before those systems can be reviewed. Trent had seen it happen. He was not going to let it happen here. Chief Pruitt received the preservation demand on a Friday. By Monday morning, his records officer had certified in writing that all video systems from the relevant period had been preserved and would remain available for federal review. Trent had not needed to file the demand in court, had not needed to have a judge enforce it. The demand itself was sufficient. Pruitt understood the calculus. Fighting a preservation demand looked like obstruction of justice. Complying with it was the only option that left room for the narrative he was still trying to maintain, that this was an isolated incident, that Winslow was an honorable officer, that the system had worked as designed. The system had not worked as designed. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to work, to protect officers from the consequences of their conduct through a specific combination of institutional loyalty, inadequate investigation, and strategic language. At Fort Belvoir, Sergeant Paul Hennessy from the Army Criminal Investigation Division sat across a table from Adrian Carr in a small, formal room with nothing on the walls. Hennessy was 51, had been conducting CID investigations for 2 decades, and carried himself with the kind of professional precision that came from having seen enough institutional misconduct to understand that precision was the only thing that made a record defensible. He asked Carr to walk him through the incident step by step. Carr did. Hennessy took notes. He did not interrupt. He did not ask leading questions. He simply documented what Carr told him, the timeline, the words that had been spoken, the physical sensations, the 41 minutes of detention. Hennessy asked one question. "Did you make any recording of the incident?" Carr said. "Yes, my phone. I placed it on the hood of my car," Hennessy asked. "Do you have access to that recording now?" Carr said. "No. It's in the possession of the police department, but I understand the footage has already been recovered." Hennessy nodded. He did not elaborate. He simply noted this in his file. CID reports were written for a specific purpose, to establish, in military institutional language, what had happened and whether it violated federal law or the Uniform Code of Military Justice. CID reports were not prosecution documents. They were investigative documents. But they carried weight because they were written by the institution that had the most to lose if the findings were wrong, the Army itself. Hennessy finished the interview. He stood, shook Carr's hand, and said, "Thank you for your time, Colonel. This is being taken seriously at the highest levels." Carr understood what Hennessy meant. The highest levels meant the Pentagon. The Pentagon meant the Secretary of the Army. The Secretary of the Army meant the case had moved beyond local jurisdiction and into the realm of federal institutional power. 6 weeks into the 8-week timeline, Trent received a phone call from a lawyer representing Kessler County's insurance carrier. The lawyer's name was Richard Castillo. He was calling, he said, to discuss the possibility of resolving the matter without further litigation. Kessler County was prepared to offer a settlement. The figure was $3.2 million. The condition was non-negotiable. The phone recording that Carr had made in the parking lot, the recording that captured Winslow's specific words. "I don't care what's on your chest," could be from a costume store, would be sealed as part of the settlement agreement. It would not be entered into any public record. It would not be made available for testimony. It would not exist in the world beyond the sealed file. Castillo framed this as protection. "Your client won't have to relive this in a courtroom," he said. "He won't have to testify. He can put this behind him. The money addresses his damages. The seal protects his privacy. Everyone wins." Trent listened. He did not respond immediately. He said he would present the offer to his client and get back to Castillo with an answer. He hung up the phone and understood, in that moment, what his flaw had become. He had been so focused on building the institutional case, the federal charges, the prosecution, the conviction, that he had nearly missed the fact that building the case and earning the moment when Carr could speak were not the same thing. The case could be won in silence, but the silence would erase the reason the case mattered. He called Carr and asked him to come to the DOJ field office in Arlington. Carr came. They sat in a conference room with a table and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. Trent explained the offer. He explained the condition. He explained the legal mechanics. A sealed settlement meant the case would be closed without a judgment, without a public record of wrongdoing, without institutional accountability. Carr listened. When Trent finished, Carr asked one question. "Does the footage stay in the record?" Trent said. "No. Under the proposed terms, the footage is sealed. It becomes part of the settlement file. It's not discoverable. It's not public." Carr was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. Then he said, "Then I'm not interested." Trent said, "This is $3.2 million. This is immediate resolution. This is your life back." Carr said, "My life is not something that needs to be behind me. What happened in that parking lot needs to be in front of me. It needs to be in the record. It needs to be part of the official documentation of what happened, so that it can't happen the same way to someone else and disappear the same way it almost disappeared for me." Trent understood, in that moment, what Hennessy had already understood. The case was no longer about damages or compensation, or even criminal conviction. The case was about visibility. Carr was refusing the settlement because accepting it would mean accepting that what Winslow had done could be made to vanish through the correct application of institutional mechanisms. And Carr had spent 22 years in an institution that taught you that visibility, documentation, the official record, your own voice in the transcript, was the only power available to you when everything else had been taken. Trent gathered his papers. He called Castillo back and told him the offer had been declined. Castillo said, "Your client is making a mistake." Trent said, "No, your client is..." He hung up. The settlement offer expired. The case moved toward trial. Carr had chosen the path that meant testimony, which meant his voice in a courtroom, which meant the transcript would exist, which meant the words, "I don't care what's on your chest," could be from a costume store, would be spoken aloud, recorded, entered into the official record, and made part of the permanent institutional documentation of what Brett Winslow had decided to do on a November morning in a parking lot 45 degrees off a man's bumper. The case was no longer about resolution. It was about accountability, and accountability, by definition, could not be sealed. "Ash, the generals arrive." On the morning of the federal preliminary hearing, the rain had returned to the courthouse steps, lighter than it had been in the parking lot, but still enough that the marble was slick and the sound of footsteps echoed through the entryway with precision. Brigadier General Yolanda Okafor arrived at 8:47 a.m. with 2 Department of Justice attorneys and a criminal investigation division liaison. She was 52, moved with the specific economy of someone who had spent 30 years in military service, and carried with her the implicit authority of an institution that had already decided where it stood. Her arrival was not ceremonial. It was operational. It was the Pentagon's way of making visible, in a federal courthouse, that the United States Army was going to be present at every moment of this proceeding, and that the institution's interest in the outcome was permanent and total. What Okafor's presence in that courthouse meant, though no one stated it aloud, was that 6 weeks earlier, in a DOJ field office conference room, Adrian Carr had chosen to refuse a $3.2 million settlement that would have sealed the dashcam footage. That refusal had put him on a trajectory that led directly to this moment. A federal preliminary hearing, a general officer in dress uniform in the gallery, and the specific understanding that the story was no longer about what happened to one man in a parking lot, but about what the institution was prepared to do about it. Without Carr's refusal, Okafor would not have been here. The official record would have remained silent. The promotion board letter, the one that cited his unshakable composure under direct enemy fire, Iraq, 2004 inches, would have stayed in a personnel file that no one outside the Pentagon would ever see. Carr arrived at the courthouse at 8:15 a.m. With Denise, he was in dress uniform. He had not been required to wear it. He had chosen to. He wanted the judge to see what Brett Winslow had decided to restrain on wet asphalt. Not a civilian, but a uniformed officer of the United States Army. The courtroom doors opened at 8:30 a.m. Trent was already there, laying out exhibits on the counsel table. He had 3 items: the dash cam footage from Derek Vance's truck, the phone recording that Carr had made by placing his device face up on the hood of his car, and a printed transcript of that recording, word for word, testimony ready. At 9:20 a.m., with the judge seated and the gallery filling behind him, Trent stood and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to play a recording made by the complainant during the incident in question. Winslow was in the gallery. He had been advised not to speak. His union representative sat next to him. Winslow had shaved that morning. He was wearing a sports coat over a button-down shirt. He looked like a man waiting for a procedure to be explained to him, not a man facing federal charges." The recording played. The audio came through the courtroom speakers, the sound quality high and unambiguous. The viewer heard the parking lot, the rain, the specific moment when Carr's voice said, "Officer, what can I help you with today?" Then Winslow's response, clipped and loaded. "Step away from the vehicle." The recording continued. Every word, every command, every moment where Carr's voice remained steady and Winslow's remained escalatory. And then, near the end of the 41-minute detention, the specific line that had been the reason for everything, Winslow saying, with a particular inflection that made clear his certainty, "I don't care what's on your chest. Could be from a costume store." The recording ended. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The judge looked at the bench in front of her for a moment. Then she looked at Trent. Trent stood. He walked to the evidence table and picked up the printed transcript. He turned to Carr and said, quietly, "Colonel, I'm going to ask you to read into the record the statement the officer made regarding your uniform." Carr stood. He was not performing anything. He was not performing indignation or vindication or relief. He was simply present. He had placed his phone on a car hood in the rain 11 weeks ago, precisely so that this moment would be possible, so that his own voice would not be the only testimony to what had been said. He had spent 11 weeks preparing for the possibility that he would have to read his own name into a federal record. Now the moment was here. He read the passage. His voice was flat, deliberate. The voice of a man who understood that precision carried more weight than emotion. He read, "I don't care what's on your chest. Could be from a costume store." He set the transcript down. He sat. Trent took the document and entered it into evidence. Then Brigadier General Yolanda Okafor rose. She did not speak conversationally. She spoke in the formal register of official statement, the language designed to make every word part of the permanent record, designed to ensure that what she was about to say could never be erased or reframed or explained away. She had prepared a written statement, a document that had been reviewed by the Pentagon's legal counsel and approved for federal entry. She read it aloud. Colonel Adrian Carr received his promotion to the rank of full colonel in 2019, following a comprehensive board review. His promotion board letter, which is entered into this record as Exhibit 7, contains the following citation. Colonel Carr has demonstrated unshakable composure under direct enemy fire. Iraq, 2004. This officer's documented military bearing under conditions of actual mortal threat is the basis for his advancement to senior command. That same composure, demonstrated again on November 18th of this year in a parking lot, was not evasion. It was not resistance. It was the specific trained discipline of a man who understood that his response to pressure was being recorded. The defendant's characterization of that composure as suspicious, his statement that the colonel's uniform could be from a costume store, reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the authority he was confronting. The defendant did not encounter a civilian in a parking lot. He encountered a brigadier general in waiting, a man whose rank had been earned through decades of service and whose bearing under pressure had been officially documented and recognized by the institution that trained him. The statement ended. Okafor sat down. The two documents, the promotion board letter and the phone recording transcript, were now sitting in the same federal filing. They had not been compared by the narrator. They did not need to be. The judge understood what she was reading. Winslow's characterization of Carr's composure as suspicious had just been confronted by a general officer's testimony that that same composure was precisely the mark of a trained military professional. The contradiction was not subtle. It was not accidental. It was the specific point of the statement. The hearing continued for another 40 minutes. Trent presented the dashcam footage in full. He presented the 7 prior complaints against Winslow. He presented the CID investigation's findings. He presented the preservation demand that had protected the in-car camera system from being archived before federal review. He presented the calculation, 41 minutes of detention without cause, performed by an officer with a documented pattern of conducting detention against black male civilians, all of whom had filed complaints, none of which had been sustained. The judge took notes. She did not speak. She let Trent finish. Then she looked at Winslow's union representative and asked if there was anything to present in defense. The rep stood. He argued that the officer had been operating on information from a dispatch report. He argued that the initial approach had been lawful and that the detention had followed proper procedure. He argued that the phone recording might have been edited or might not reflect the full context of the interaction. Trent stood immediately. Your Honor, the phone recording is corroborated by the dashcam footage from an independent civilian witness. There is no question of editing or authenticity. And as for procedure, the procedure in question appears to have been applied 7 separate times to black male civilians over a 4-year period, with no sustained findings in any case. That is not procedure. That is pattern. The judge nodded. She said she had heard enough. She announced her ruling from the bench. The defendant, Brett Winslow, is bound over for federal trial on 2 counts of civil rights violation under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. 1 count carries the bodily injury enhancement based on the duration of the detention, 41 minutes, and the physical restraint employed. The defendant will be released on his own recognizance pending trial, with the conditions that he surrender his passport and submit to electronic monitoring. Winslow's face did not change. His union rep leaned over and said something to him. Winslow nodded. He stood, walked out of the gallery, and left the courthouse. He had not looked at Carr. He had not acknowledged the proceeding in any way that suggested he understood what had just happened to him. Chief Pruitt, C., who had been sitting in the 3rd row of the gallery, stood and walked out without speaking to anyone. He did not congratulate Winslow. He did not speak to the union rep. He simply left, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that defending Winslow publicly had meant endorsing every one of those 7 complaints, endorsing his statement about a costume store uniform, endorsing the 41 minutes of detention on wet asphalt, And in defending Winslow, Pruitt had not protected his officer. He had buried his entire department under the weight of that defense. The hearing ended. People began to move toward the exits. A courthouse reporter who had been covering the case approached Carr in the gallery. She asked, "Colonel, do you want to say anything to the camera?" Carr looked at her. He did not hesitate. He said, "Everything I needed to say is already in the record." He turned, found Denise in the crowd, and walked toward the doors. She took his arm. They walked down the marble steps together. The rain was lighter now than it had been this morning. It was the kind of rain that was starting to break, that was beginning to move north, that had begun to lose its weight. Carr and Denise walked down the steps, across the plaza, toward the parking lot, behind them, in the courthouse. The federal record was being finalized. The transcript was being sealed into the official documentation. Winslow's words, "I don't care what's on your chest," could be from a costume store, were now part of the permanent institutional record of a federal civil rights violation. They could not be erased. They could not be sealed. They could not be made to disappear. They had become what Carr had placed his phone on a car hood to make them: undeniable, documented, and part of the official accountability that would follow in the reckoning. On the morning of Brett Winslow's sentencing, Adrian Carr arrived at Trent's office before dawn. The shadow box was still on the conference table where Carr had placed it the morning of the preliminary hearing, not as an exhibit to be entered into evidence, but as a decision made visible. The box was solid wood with a glass front, and behind the glass were the specific objects that had defined a portion of his life. A combat action badge, earned in Fallujah in 2004, a ribbon bar from his second deployment, another from his third. They were the physical manifestations of choices he had made, consequences he had lived, and a career he had constructed one decision at a time. He picked up the box. He did not look at the contents. He simply carried it from the conference table to his car. He placed it in the trunk. He did not bring it into the courthouse. The sentencing did not need the shadow box as testimony. The sentencing needed only the transcript, the evidence, and the judgment of a federal judge who had read the full case file and understood what she was looking at. The sentencing hearing took 45 minutes. The judge sentenced Brett Winslow to 14 months in federal prison, with 3 years of supervised release following his discharge. She imposed an additional financial penalty. Winslow was personally liable for $120,000 of the $3.85 million civil settlement that Kessler County was obligated to pay. This was a deliberate choice by the judge, not to require the county to absorb the entirety of the liability, but to ensure that Winslow himself carried a permanent financial consequence for what he had done. He would carry it for years. Every payment would remind him that his choice in a parking lot had cost him, directly and personally, in a way that could not be forgiven or forgotten. Kessler County's obligation was entered into the civil record that afternoon. Chief Gerald Pruitt announced his resignation 2 days later. He did not cite the settlement. He did not cite the federal case or the preliminary hearing, or the fact that his department's 7 unsustained complaints against Winslow were about to be subjected to a formal state oversight review. He simply stated that he was stepping down effective immediately, citing personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with his family. What Pruitt did not state, but what everyone understood, was that defending Winslow had cost him his career. The public statement he had made, "Officer Winslow has served this community without a single sustained complaint," had become the exact mechanism by which his entire department was now under examination. The 7 complaints that he had said were unsustained were now being formally reviewed by the state's Internal Affairs Oversight Board, each one. The one from 2021 involving a black male civilian who alleged excessive force. The one from 2020 involving a detention without probable cause. The one from this year, the one that had started everything, which was no longer unsustained. It had become a federal conviction. Pruitt's resignation was the institutional consequence of defending a man whose conduct could not be defended. He had tried. He had used careful language. He had employed the specific terminology of police procedure: sustained versus unsustained, proper protocol, lawful exercise of authority. But none of those words had protected him, because the words could not overcome what the video showed. What the video showed was a man placing his hand on another man's shoulder without cause, issuing commands that had no legal basis, conducting a detention that served no purpose except the assertion of authority where no authority existed. That evening, Carr and Denise sat in their kitchen. The shadow box was on the table between them. Denise picked it up, turned it over once in her hands, and set it back down without opening it. She did not need to look inside. She had looked inside 1,000 times over 11 months, not at the ribbons, but at what the box represented, the portion of her husband's life that had been held in suspension, waiting to see whether the institution he had served would do right by him, or whether it would absorb the blow and move on. "What happens with the review?" she asked. The general officer review, the one that would determine whether Carr's promotion to general officer would proceed or would be delayed further, had been delayed 11 months by the administrative fallout from the incident. It had been reinstatement. Finally, just that morning, Carr's file would be reconsidered in 6 days. "It gets reconsidered," Carr said. "In 6 days. Then it's done. Either it proceeds or it doesn't." Denise nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something to him that had nothing to do with the review, or the record, or the federal verdict, or the shadow box, or any of the institutional machinery that had consumed the last 11 months of their life. She said something that was specific to the two of them, in their kitchen, on a Tuesday evening, something that acknowledged the fact that they had been holding this together and that they could finally set it down. Carr laughed. It was the first time in 11 months that his laugh had sounded like something other than management, other than control. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes when you realize that the worst thing that could happen has already happened. You have survived it, and the people you love are still standing next to you. He stood. He walked to the counter. He removed his car keys from his pocket. He set them down on the counter, next to the shadow box, in his own house, on a Tuesday evening, 11 months late and exactly on time. The keys made a small sound when they landed on the granite, a brief metallic clink that was nothing. That was everything. He was home, not returned to his life by an institution that had decided to grant him clemency or permission or validation. Home because he had chosen. 11 weeks into a federal investigation. To refuse a settlement that would have sealed his own words and kept him silent. Home because he had placed a phone on a car hood in the rain and trusted that someone would see it. Home because he had read his own voice back into the official record in a courtroom in front of a general officer and a federal judge, and a man who would spend 14 months in federal prison understanding. Finally, that the uniform on Carr's chest had been real. The general officer review would proceed in 6 days. It would be approved, and Carr would continue his career in the rank that his service had earned him. But that outcome did not matter in this moment. What mattered was that he was standing in his kitchen, his keys on the counter, his wife on the other side of the table. and the shadow box between them containing the artifacts of a life that was no longer suspended. The life could be lived now, not without cost. The cost had been paid, in full and in the record. But the cost was behind him, not ahead, and ahead of him was only the ordinary, necessary work of being present to the people he loved, in the place he had earned the right to come home to, in his own house, on a Tuesday, with his keys on the counter and his wife asking him what he wanted for dinner.